Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, saluting Earth Day on April 22nd with an ongoing commitment to help offset carbon emissions with sustainable harvesting of Missouri forests. Details at choosewood.com.
This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Elaine Cha.
You know, it's one thing to do something on the weekends with your family, but 7 days a week, 5 days a week, it's a lot. And you run out of ideas. You're not the expert at that.
A lot of these teachers, it requires more certification, more continuing education than any other profession.
It's not babysitting. We're not supposed to just be putting warm bodies in here to look at children and make sure that they're just eating breakfast, lunch, and snack. Throughout those hours, we are developing brains.
At the end of September, the Child Care Stabilization Program, which is the federal funding that supported child care and early childhood education providers at the height of the pandemic, will end. This program was part of the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA, and it helped keep the lights on in daycare centers across the nation and pay educators at least a livable wage. Without that money, it is estimated that 70,000 child care centers across the country may face closure. This childcare crisis will impact more than parents with young children. During today's show, we'll spend the entire hour exploring the importance of early childhood education for children, families, and our society, the inequities in access to early childhood education, and what is at stake if our state and federal governments continue down a path of underfunding education for millions of Americans. And we'll be taking your calls, tweets, and emails too. But first, let's start with the basics. Joining me in the studio is Shona Lamond, Executive Director of the Downtown Children's Center in St. Louis. Shona, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Elaine, for having me back.
Now, Shona, you were here last in July to discuss the rising cost of health care, and we left a great deal on the table. We just opened the segment, too, by underscoring the end of the Child Care Stabilization Program. So let's begin there. How did that funding help you at the Downtown Children's Center?
So the funding helped us just like it helped all the other centers, small home facilities, daycares that were able to take advantage of it by keeping our doors open, paying our staff, continuing with their benefits, and being there to serve the families in our community. Mm-hmm. And without it, there would be even less ability to serve the families than the dire situation that we're currently in.
Mm-hmm. Now, what is it that is going to happen next, then, at least for you?
You know, that's a really good question. Right now we're in a pretty darn good spot based on the fact that we've been able to access the grants and the funding that's been available. But if things continue without that funding, it gets really harder and harder to pay the staff wages, and I'm not going to even say really great wages, to pay them kind of minimal wage, mm-hmm. and really continue to remain open and be there for the families. Long term, that's a conversation that our board and I have frequently as a nonprofit, and our sustainability and strategic planning for the future.
Mm-hmm. So you're talking about what needs to be done on the level of your organization, but there's a reason early childhood education is important. So let's also talk about that kind of more broadly. What is it that makes learning from birth to age 5 so critical, Shona?
Oh, that's a really great question. And this is one that I don't really feel that is particularly voiced often enough just across the nation to everybody, and anybody and everybody that will listen. So I think you have to basically start with the science of a baby, young child's brain. And it's powerful to understand that you're born with all the neurons that you're ever going to have in your brain. And, the experiences that you have from birth through 5 shape the development of those neurons. And by the time you hit age 5, your brain is 90% developed. Doesn't mean that you can't continue to grow and learn, but you're not getting more neurons. Those neurons, depending on your experiences, are being filed away in like little file cabinets inside your brain to grow your experiences. Or, if you are living in adversity, those neurons are being pruned, and those connections that you're making with the world around you can really change and shift. We get one shot at a child being a young child, birth through 5, and it's really critical in those years that people understand how important it really is to ensure that they have an enriching environment, one that is positive, one in which traumas and negativity or even violence is minimum, so that they really can be positive members of our society moving forward.
And the extent to which that age where your brain is soft and receptive. I had brain surgery some like 20 years ago.
Wow.
And I did not speak English before I started kindergarten, just Korean. And after surgery, I had a hard time speaking English. And so I think that was something that really drove that home for me personally. A part of education is also social and emotional skills, gaining those, practicing those. How difficult is it, Shona, for children after the age of 5 to acquire those skills?
So I believe, along with many scientists, research, and there's plenty of data to support this, that besides just growing the cognitive development, the academic development, really the biggest part of all of that for this birth to 5 is that social emotional component in all of this. It is critical that children have individuals that are modeling for them behaviors that we want to see them model, whether in their home, in school, out in their communities. And the ability to lay that foundation is just so critical in those formative early years. As children move into kindergarten, if they haven't really formed some solid skills for understanding empathy, being kind, working cooperatively, knowing how to perhaps solve children's problems, once you hit kindergarten, the academics are just being, thrown at them, and it's intense. And if they don't have those skills, they're not going to be able to learn very well. They're not going to be able to get along with their peers. They're really going to struggle. And the more a child struggles, the further and further behind they get. And I think we all know adults who really struggle to regulate their emotions. And, odds are if we could talk to those individuals, we probably would discover that there were things that, were going on in their lives, their families' lives, changes that maybe prevented them from getting those foundations needed to really be successful.
I think that also gets at some of the misconceptions about what early childhood education is. There are plenty of aspects of care, and we've talked about child care on this show. It's, watching after a child while a parent or parents are at work. But for folks who could use a primer, Shona, what are the differences between babysitting and the education that happens in early childhood?
Oh, that's an excellent question, and it's one that I really love to talk about. Probably the biggest piece in all of this is in talking to just anybody on the street. When they find out I'm in early childhood, their comment will be, "Oh, you work in a daycare." And people's perception of daycare certainly does a huge disservice to those of us in early childhood. Daycare is kind of a negative identity to me in that it's babysitting. People presume every single time that we're babysitting. We're occupying the children, we're doing fun activities with them, but early childhood education is so much more than that. I have my bachelor's degree in early childhood education. I went to college for a very long time to hone my skills to be able to deliver a really quality education for these children, and more importantly, have a really deep understanding of the developmental milestones and to really understand how to deliver that social emotional instruction that doesn't just necessarily come naturally to people. Babysitting absolutely serves a purpose. And I think a lot of the centers that are identified as daycares, we're doing a disservice in not recognizing that they're early childhood centers. Mm-hmm. They are providing high quality education and that social emotional component to it. Yeah. And it's not just as simple as throwing activities out at them to do. It's understanding how to help children learn in a manner that their young brains can really soak up and then apply to their real world circumstances. Mm-hmm. So they can take it from the classroom and use it at home, use it at the grocery store, use it visiting grandma, and being able to apply it to the learning that takes place in kindergarten mm-hmm. and the rest of their education.
So, during the pandemic, mm-hmm. because there were so many child care centers, mm-hmm. some maybe who were providing more education than others, they were not operating because they simply could not just because of the money, but because people were staying home. How do you think the pandemic affected maybe the way people think about and treat childcare versus and early childhood education?
Well, the pandemic certainly changed lots of aspects of our world in the early childhood realm. I strongly believe we have greater advocates that were grown out of families who have young children or grandparents and extended family who were doing their very best to meet the needs of little children whose parents, needed to work. They desperately needed to work. So there certainly is a growing population of individuals who are really truly understanding. I've heard from so many moms and dads who, because their center wasn't open or there wasn't staffing, even though the center wanted to be open, or, they're in an area where they were required to close, families were forced to try and cobble together, care for their child. Maybe they were working, maybe they weren't. Doesn't really matter. I think a lot of them discovered it is not easy to even just simply occupy a child for, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 hours or more. Mm-hmm. It's one thing to do something on the weekends with your family, but 7 days a week, 5 days a week, it's a lot, and you run out of ideas. You're not the expert at that. So families really struggled, and I got a lot of positive feedback in terms of hearing how grateful people were to educators and the experts that were able to provide these things when it was available again. Mm-hmm.
We are going to take a very quick break here, but when we come back, we'll bring 2 more guests to our roundtable discussion about the state of early childhood education. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, saluting Earth Day on April 22nd with an ongoing commitment to help offset carbon emissions with sustainable harvesting of Missouri forests. Details at choosewood.com.
Welcome back. Let's add 2 more voices to the discussion. We have in studio Aimee Washington-Hart, who is Executive Director of Unipress Kinder Cottage in East St. Louis, Illinois. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
And we also have Paula-Breonne Vickers, who is Director of Early Childhood Power Building at We Power. Paula, welcome to you too.
Thank you for having me as well.
So before the break, we had talked about the federal relief. And Aimee, the beginning of the show, we noted that federal funding is going to end at the end of the month in just over a week from now. What does that mean for you and Kinder Cottage?
Well, it's going to affect a lot of families in the Metro East. And with that being said and understood, we will have to seek out additional funding from other sources, which is a real big challenge, especially since we do not want any child to be left behind. Mm-hmm. So with the loss of additional dollars that support not just children's material and resources, it also affects staffing and that support. It's going to be a hardship to continue quality care in the Metro East.
Mm-hmm. And how will you be making that up? Will you be forced to pass along those costs to those who are already sending their children to you?
It's definitely going to take some creativity in finding additional funding, whether it's legislating for more dollars, seeking out grants, and requesting community partnerships to engage in legislating for more dollars for the children.
Mm-hmm. And Shona, for your part, is that the same approach that you're taking? You mentioned earlier some of the things that you'd be doing, but is there a passing along the cost to families also part of the discussion?
Oh, 100%. We just did a significant tuition increase. We increased 8.5% just strictly to put more money in the teachers' pockets. So that's huge. Mm-hmm. That's huge for families. Yeah. And I'm always really fearful that families won't be able to afford it. Subsidy doesn't really cover it. Scholarships, it's really about seeking out more opportunities for scholarships. Yeah.
Well, and scholarship is the right word here because we're talking about early childhood education, again, not babysitting. I want to really underscore that point. Paula, what is your take on the end of these federal funds through ARPA and what their effects are?
Yeah, so I have two lenses that I look through it. I'm a mom, so I have a 3-year-old and a 2-year-old. So I'm one of the parents that the cost might be passed on to. So there's that pit in my stomach of worry of like, what does my budget look like now? And also, like, what does it look like for my children's teachers, because they're teachers, to be properly cared for? So this funding was the first time that some of these centers were able to give their teachers benefits. Sometimes it was the first time that they were able to get a living wage. So as a parent, it worries me because when I drop my children off, I want to know that their teachers have their needs met, that when they're going home, they're able to provide for their families and they're able to show up as their best selves, because this is an age that is vulnerable and difficult for a lot of people. Yeah. I tell people that, even coming from a background of social work and education, it's one thing to be skilled working in the K-12 space, but early childhood is a profession all in its own because they have to wear so many hats. And so I want those teachers to be able to show up and be able to be their best selves. And that looks like still having their benefits, still having their health care, still having their living wage, or even a little better, so that they're not having to work multiple jobs before coming to show up for these little babies, because little babies are a lot of energy.
Yes,
and then in my role at We Power, it looks like having to have these conversations with center directors that are being impacted. And some of the conversation is also like, do we have to cut our teachers' benefits? Do we have to cut their pay? Like, we just were able to give them a little bit more. And now it's like that conversation happening. And it's heartbreaking. Yeah. It's heartbreaking. It's stressful. It creates a worry. And so that's where I'm at with it.
Yeah.
And you know what? If I could interrupt, I'd like to put some cold, hard numbers to that.
Oh, please do.
I'd really want people to understand. So the perfect example is I work with teachers who they don't have their bachelor's degree, but they've been working for 25, 26 years at the same school. They're lucky to be making $20 an hour. That's $40,000 a year. Yeah. That's it for their dedication and their experience. I have people with bachelor's degrees, 10 plus years, again, making $20, $21 an hour. There are hardly any other industries across the nation, other countries, where people make such low rates of pay for such a stressful job. I want people to understand that we're really proud of the work we do, but we have children's lives in our hands. So it's not even just about educating. It's about the seriousness of their safety and ensuring that they're not injured. And it can be a very stressful job. We want our teachers to be happy. Benefits is exceptionally important and is a huge component. Luckily, I'm able to have decent benefits, but I have teachers 25, 26 years that have no pension. No pension, no retirement. They will be living on Social Security when they retire.
Wow.
Yeah. So clearly, it is not an issue that is one that affects parents and children only, which is what we mentioned at the top, but also those who have dedicated their time and need to make a living through what they're doing in many cases for like over a couple of decades. Paula, as a parent, and I want to also recognize that all of us sitting here at the table, we're all parents. We all have children. Paula, what are the difficulties that you face when looking for education and care for not just one child, but two?
Yeah, so I was one of the people in bringing to the conversation as well, because we would talk about who will be impacted, the workforce. So this has actually been a career change for me because I was so closely impacted of being forced out of the workforce because I couldn't find care that I trusted. I couldn't find care that was available. So when we're looking at what it looks like, there's looking into quality. Even prior to COVID, it was hard to get into a center. Like there are wait lists that exist.
Right.
And then those wait lists became greater and larger because of COVID. And so COVID really opened up and it exposed the cracks in the system. So I was being forced out of the workforce because, and that's where I'm like, we need to talk about like women's rights, because if we're talking about who's being forced out, for my family, it was going to be me. And I was the person that went and earned a master's degree. Like I loved my career. I didn't want to be forced out.
Sure.
So looking at that and like how what that looks like, it looked like strategy. It looked like changing my career in order to like find something that worked for getting my children in a space that I could be comfortable and happy with and going about my day, because it's stressful as a new mom. I experienced postpartum depression. It was like being a first time mom, to leave your child somewhere. You have to have a level of trust there. And that trust looks like, okay, well, I feel like my teachers are being taken care of. And so because of that, I feel that much more comfortable leaving my children in their hands. I know that they're highly skilled. A lot of these teachers, it requires more certification, more continuing education than any other profession. And literally, they're being paid so much less than other roles.
Yeah. Now, Aimee, as the director of Kinder Cottage, you're not only the executive director of this care facility, right? This education center. There are other ways to provide quality care to children, outside what happens in a facility like that. And you are an infant toddler specialist and trainer. I did not know that this existed before the show. And you're also a quality specialist with Brightpoint, formerly known as Children's Home and Aid. What is it that families can get as far as that kind of quality early childhood education in their homes?
So just a correction,
Yeah.
I was formerly their quality specialist and
okay.
trained. I am a PITC trainer as well.
Okay.
And over 4 years, I did work with Children Home and Aid. But right now, my sole job with Bright Points is just a trainer.
Okay.
However, I have the experience of quality care and a PITC trainer and infant toddler specialist skill set.
Right.
So I do have a certification. So with that being said, we do acknowledge the parents being the first teachers, right? And there are a lot of programs on the Illinois side, as well as I'm just going to touch maybe on in the Metro East that have home programs that will go into the home, and they're called PI programs. They're early intervention programs that will go into the home and support families with a curriculum, weekly visits, and monthly activities for socialization. So there are some options out there that support parents that are in the home. However, I have to agree with Paula. Individuals should not have to go through their career choices and get the job of their choice and be productive citizens. And then once they decide to have families, have to make hard choices of, do I return to the passion and field that I love, or do I stay at home because I cannot find quality care and supportive services where I'm comfortable leaving my child in that center or home due to the lack of trust in affordable care. Mm-hmm. You shouldn't have to choose to paying your mortgage or paying for child care. It shouldn't be a choice like that.
With all of your mother or parent hats on, I mean, I know, Paula, for you had to make a really difficult choice. Shona and Aimee, did you also face the same dilemma?
Well, my children are now grown. However, I was a bit fortunate because I had a grandmother who was at home, right? So my journey was different. However, it made me very sensitive to the matter that I had that option, and my children were able to be with my grandmother until they went to pre-K. And so hearing the struggles, the concerns, having the sensitive level of empathy for families who have to walk away and leave their 6-week-old baby, right, with someone you just met at intake for 20 minutes. That's a bit calling. Mm-hmm. That's a bit calling. Yeah. And then on the other side, to ask teachers to give their all. Professional development is expected. Continuing educational hours are expected. Speaking with families on their off time and on weekends and having that same relationship with families, and then saying you're only worth minimum wage is just an unfair system that we need to look into changing.
Shona, in your experience, is there like a story or an anecdote you can share about someone who worked for one of the centers that you were a part of? You formerly worked with SLPS too. Correct. Where you had someone who was an employee and then had to leave the job. They wanted to do the right thing, for their own children with early childhood education, but could not afford it, and then ultimately had to leave their job.
I do. I think there are a lot of educators. If you talk to educators in general, you're going to find that there are many of them that once they have their own young children, either the center that perhaps they're working at is too expensive, or maybe they don't offer that specific age, or they don't have space. So they're having to make some really tough choices on, are they going to work? Am I going to change what I'm doing? Am I going to be able to bring in the same amount? And they're leaving the profession. They may return to the profession once their child is able to be enrolled in K through 12. But even that is really impactful. Educators, whether you're birth through 5 or you're K through 12, we all work long hours. Mm-hmm. We all work outside of the school day. And if you want to be engaged in your children's lives, your personal children's lives, there's some really hard choices you have to make. I was fortunate that I was a stay-at-home mom for a bit, and that's how I got involved in early childhood. Mm-hmm. And I have my kids are grown, like Aimee's, but I have a 3-year-old grandson whose own mom and dad really struggled with, what are they going to do? Mm-hmm. They were lucky enough that I'm able to take advantage of my school's discount as a grandparent, and an educator in the school that he can attend. But I don't know what they would do if they didn't have that. I mean, that's a privilege for them. Mm-hmm. It's a real privilege. And I think they would be just as much at a loss as all these other families that we are talking about.
So we're going to take a quick break here, but we'll be back shortly to continue this conversation. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, saluting Earth Day on April 22nd with an ongoing commitment to help offset carbon emissions with sustainable harvesting of Missouri forests. Details at choosewood.com.
Welcome back. We're discussing early childhood education today with a roundtable of educators and advocates. Shona Lamond, Executive Director of Downtown Children's Center, Aimee Washington-Hart, Executive Director of UniPres Kinder Cottage in East St. Louis, Illinois, and Paula-Breonne Vickers, Director of Early Childhood Power Building at We Power. Now, before the break, we were talking about the money that is not there, about the way that folks who work in childcare, early childhood education, are underpaid, and that there are just resources that are missing all over the place. And I want to make sure that we talk about the differences that exist between East St. Louis, the Illinois side of the river, as well as Missouri. And we want to make sure that we hear from you. Have you had to rely on family members to help out with childcare because of costs, whether that's for you as a parent or a grandparent? If you've had to make changes to your career, which we talked about earlier, in order to accommodate caring for and bringing up your child, we want to hear about that too. Give us a call at 314-382-8255. That's 314-382-TALK, or you can email us at talk@stlpr.org. Getting funding for education professionals overall. We've acknowledged that that's a hot button topic. How does funding for early childhood education compare to what's there for K through 12? Aimee, what does that look like in Illinois?
Well, in our great state of Illinois, we do have subsidy child care program. We also do collaborative services that makes it more affordable for families. But again, that's for families that qualify. And that's also contingent on if the program is collaborated.
Okay.
So, for instance, my program is just child care only with subsidy scholarship programs through various churches and generous donors. However, there are other programs that are collaborated with, like Head Start funding and state pre-K and PI programs that make it a little bit more affordable for families to have full-day child care services.
Mm-hmm.
Can I add on the difference between Missouri and Illinois subsidy rate? So for Illinois, a family could be a middle-income family and be comfortable in being a middle-income family, and then if their income changes, they still get like a cushion time of how long they can stay on subsidy. But in Illinois, a family could make over like around $52,000 and still receive subsidy, whereas in Missouri, a family of three can't make more than around $25,000. So a low-income family. So half of what Illinois allows for subsidy. So when we're talking about like receiving subsidy, many families in Missouri, especially if you are just barely in middle income or just, little even over being a lower income or so much of the poverty line, you don't get any assistance. Whereas like Illinois, they're like, you know what, we want to support our middle income family,
Absolutely.
keep our families, able to thrive and get some kind of support.
Yeah.
We don't have that here in Missouri.
Yeah, and pushing towards that legislation idea of taking the consideration of middle class, because that dollar amount could go back into poverty, and that's not to go to recycle poverty. We want our communities to be thriving, and so making that voice and ensuring that we are reaching the need of families so they can support their families and be that model of good citizenship through education for their children makes a big difference.
What do you think accounts for that difference between Illinois and Missouri and what they're willing to provide?
It boils down to politics.
Yeah.
I think we all just smiled at each other. Because it's there, right? And that's where, so one of the things over on this side, the Early Childhood Power and Policy Action Group, is a coalition of center directors we're working to come together to raise our collective power to talk to our legislators. Because when you're this close to another state that is doing better by their families when it comes to support for childcare, it's hard not to know. So, like, what does that look like to have these conversations with our legislators of like, hey, we know it can be done. We see it 15 minutes across a bridge. What does it look like for Missouri families? And it's the greatest return on investment. It's ensuring public safety. It's looking at how do we keep families in a place of thriving rather than like slapping Band-Aids on issues later in life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that difference, like if you have a good arm, a stone's throw, is really something that it's hard to wrap my mind around. And yet here it is, like right here. As far as what providers and families do to make do without funding support, like the support that will be flying away at the end of this month, what is it that they do to manage these gaps? Aimee?
That's a tricky one, right? Like it's back to being innovative in how we advocate. It's all about advocacy, making sure not that our teachers and those that's in the educational development system are advocating, but our families are aware of how this will affect them. And then our business partners, our communities are aware of how this would affect them in the long run.
Yeah.
And then collectively using that voice to say, hey, this is a system that is going to affect us all. We need to reconsider how funding is distributed for greater care because it's development. I know we often use education as the forerunner of what we do, and it is, but it's developing human minds, and we need to invest. It is not a small matter. It needs thorough consideration for change.
And to make that change, what then is the specific ask? Because you're talking about advocacy, but what is it that you say in one-on-one conversation with legislators, for example? Like, what is it that you want?
Invest in our babies. That invest in our babies. Like, there's so much, conversation happening of like even having to convince people that this profession is valuable, that this space is valuable. If nothing else, invest in our babies because they're the ones that are going to grow up and carry our society.
And so that's money. We're talking about
investing
show
money.
us the money.
Show us the money.
Yeah.
I really like numbers. I love numbers, and I love data. And there's an economist, James Heckman, and his research goes back to 2019, 2020. So I assume that the numbers are even higher. His research is showing that for every dollar invested in early childhood education, we get 13% back in return in the long run. I would like to have 13% back on my my money.
Right.
And that's huge. And that's the long run. That is not, just in the short term. I don't believe anything sustainably will change until we are recognized and wrapped into federal and state funding, just like they ensure for K through 12 public school systems.
Yes. Public education is a civil right. So like having that conversation of what it looks like to invest, it sets so many different structures and spaces up for success. When we're talking about children entering kindergarten, they can be set up to better enter kindergarten. Our teachers can be better supported. So it supports so many levels outside of who's directly impacted now. Because yes, it impacts parents, it impacts babies, it impacts early childhood education educators, but it also impacts the kindergarten teachers when they get there.
Yeah.
That was one of the things that I saw that brought me to this work, and I think it was really hard for people to ignore, is that coming out of COVID where children collectively, no matter your income, no matter, you had access or not, when people didn't have that space, children are entering kindergarten. So, and also I do preference or say that, adults make up these standards of what a kindergartner should be doing.
Right.
The kindergartners that aren't really able to sit down at a table, they're not using scissors, they can't hold a crayon. These are things that are learned in ECE spaces that people just kind of shrug their shoulders at. But when they were coming into kindergarten once schools opened back up, they weren't able to do it. Let's talk about why now. Why not.
So then what about universal pre-K? I mean, that might take a chunk out of, the population that you're serving, like the kids who are coming in. I mean, how much would that help? Even a state like Florida has universal pre-K for 4-year-olds in addition to 3 other states? Shona?
Well, that's a really good question. You know, our legislature has put money aside for universal pre-K program, and they've given a considerable amount of money. Paula probably knows those numbers better than I do. But the reality is, in talking to all of my other directors, there's hardly anybody that can even access that money due to the restrictions that they have put on it. I'm not able to access it for our school, as are most of the people that I've talked to. In fact, I don't think I know anybody that's able to access it.
Yeah, so this past legislative session, Governor Parson was able to pass $78 million for universal pre-K expansion.
Right.
However, across the state of Missouri, I think less than 50 centers were able to actually qualify for it. So we also have have to have that conversation of like, when this money is like allocated, how do people actually benefit from it?
Yeah.
Because it's one thing to like give the money and say, oh, well, no one applied. Well, why not? Like, what were the qualifications put in place? And like have conversations of who's making those qualifications.
So it's all of the asterisks that follow.
Yeah.
Right?
And I think the biggest component of that is one of the biggest asks is that the pre-K teachers all have their bachelor's degrees. And fantastic. I want them to have their bachelor's degrees. I don't know hardly anybody that's willing to take $18, $19, $15, $14 with a bachelor's degree.
Yeah.
Definitely not attracting people to the field.
No.
As a younger adult, if I had to do it all over, I wouldn't, because I wouldn't do like education as a track, because the return on investment for me putting money into a degree. But the other side of that, and this is, you know, Paula as a mom, as a community member, it takes less for someone to step in and be a substitute teacher making a lot more than it takes to be in these spaces.
Yeah.
And for me as a parent, I'm raising my eyebrow at that. Like, how is someone that has, you know, whatever the requirement is, warm body at this point, can step in and be a substitute teacher, make $200 a day or more, but then in the ECE space, it's like, we're not going to give you money for your degree. You don't have your degree. We're not going to pay you enough where you can repay a loan, but still do it. Like, that doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
At least in the public school K through 12 space, they are helping them get their bachelor's degrees. But for the state of Missouri, they've drastically reduced the requirements to even be not even a substitute teacher, but a regular classroom teacher.
Yeah, and we've talked about the crisis in the teacher space, like at K through 12, there is a severe shortage, but it really does seem like having people understand that that working with kids 0 through 5 is, again, not a matter merely of providing supervision, that there's much more at stake. And I want to make sure we start talking about that. I mean, if we keep on this path, the one that we're currently on, clearly there is a lot at stake. The Annie E. Casey Foundation has an annual report, and it's called the Kids Count Data Book, and it ranks each state on how families and children are faring with the resources they have for early childhood education. It takes economic well-being, education, health, and community into account in ranking each state. And this year, Missouri was ranked out of 50 at 28. Illinois did a little better, was at 19 overall. So, I mean, paint a picture for us. How does early childhood education access impact things like economic well-being and health, Aimee?
Well, when we think of how we're treating, I just want to piggyback on what my colleagues were speaking about today. Even though Illinois has a little bit better incentive and we legislate hard, right? When we think of health and thinking of early childhood education, it's a holistic approach. Again, it's a development. I know Shona spoke about it in depth earlier in her segment, that it's not babysitting. We're not supposed to just be putting warm bodies in here to look at children and make sure that they're just eating breakfast, lunch, and snack. Throughout those hours, we are developing brains. We are encouraging inquisitive minds. We are motivating social, emotional choices is that when they transition into kindergarten and other parts of their journey, they're making greater decisions. And so how are we supporting our educational system with resources, materials, and professional development, and investing in that system that will give what is needed to ensure that our children are well prepared. So in 10 to 15 years, we can look back and say, we did that well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I want to add on to that, too. When we're talking about health, there are a lot of screenings that take place at this age that take place in these spaces. So, again, I'm a mom. I have 2 boys, 2 beautiful, beautiful boys. I've worked with children in the K-12 space my entire professional career, but there's so much that I just don't know about 0 to 5 because I wasn't trained for that.
Sure.
Even as a social worker, as an educator, I wasn't trained. And so there are vision screenings, continued behavioral screenings, all of these things that help them in their development. It's another trusted set of eyes where we're looking at the health of a family and family well-being. I spoke earlier about experiencing postpartum depression after my second baby. Didn't have it with my first, so I didn't expect it. But having a break, because when you're trying to multitask, working full-time and taking care of babies, it's stressful. And so families that are in stress, they need support. I always tell my center director, childcare saved my life, early childhood education saved my life, and being able to have people save my life because I'm now able to have time to get a breath. I'm now able to, have time for me. I'm able to, go into my career and feel good about myself. So it's the family health as a whole, as well as the child's health.
Yeah.
Well, and if I could piggyback
sure.
on that, there's the aspect of children with developmental delays.
Oh, my goodness, yes.
And, early childhood educators can catch that really early on. And the earlier you have interventions, the more likely that child is going to be successful, particularly going into kindergarten.
Right.
And making corrections to those, deficits.
Yeah.
I call my son's teacher all the time. He hasn't been diagnosed with autism, but we're watching it, right? But I call her all the time because I don't know what to do. But we also have that relationship where I can call her, and the things that she teaches me helps me as a mom. It helps me get him the resources he needs. But I wouldn't have that if he wasn't in that space.
Right. So she's an educator for you as well.
Yes,
not just
absolutely.
For
Family education is so key. One of the things that I provide in my center is family cafes, and a lot of the schools in schools and centers in Southern Illinois offer that. And it's so important not to just say you're the first educator, but here's a space where you can connect with others and we can provide you materials and support as you educate your child with us, we develop this human being to be a great citizen for our community. And having funding for that is also key as well. Some teachers go the extra mile, some centers go the extra mile by incorporating family cafes and family programs, as well as screening and assessments. Others don't due to lack of funds, and that needs to be considered as well.
Yeah. Is there an example that you can share, Aimee, of maybe a parent who's come back to you to let you know that what their child got, 0 through 5, benefited them once they got K through 12?
I have several because I've been in the field for over 30 years. And so especially, and I just want to use the example of a family that has special needs because to me that's an underserved population and the needs is great. And the special care is at minimum. And I'm sure that's in many states. I just won't say in the Metro East. And so, walking that parent through the journey, encouraging them to legislate and use their voice to make sure that child gets the resources and the staffings and having those conversations with the providers that can provide those additional care, whether it's special OT, physical therapy, speech, whatever, right? I've gone the extra mile of even sending IEPs or IFSPs. And then, thanks to Facebook, right, you can always look back and say, this is where this child developed, this is where this family's going. And just not me, but my team has made the difference in ensuring that this child is developing and being productive in their space.
But that's the beauty, again, of early childhood development. It's not waiting until a child struggles to, step in. So many times, children, I don't want to say slip through the cracks, but overlooked until there's a very clear struggle. And it's what does it look like to get them support at 2, at 3, and they're learning these skills themselves and carrying on and just developing further and further and further.
So to wrap here, I'd like to know from each of you, in like a couple of sentences, what is the thing that would help you most at this point? Shona?
That society as a whole in the United States really understands and supports high quality education for birth through 5 for all children, regardless of their socioeconomic background, and that it's available for anybody who wants it or needs it.
Mm-hmm. Aimee?
Use your voice to change your thoughts and action plans for the growth of all our children, whether they're on the Metro East Side or in Missouri, lower area Missouri. Use your voice to advocate for greater and quality care for all our children.
Mm-hmm. And Paula?
For me, I would say come out and join our Power and Policy Action Group. That's how I was introduced to this work as a mom. It's going to take our collective voices rising and raising to get our elected officials to hear that this profession is in need of support and our babies are in need of support.
Yeah. Paula-Breonne Vickers is the Director of Early Childhood Power Building at We Power. Aimee Washington-Hart is the Executive Director of UniPres Kinder Cottage in East St. Louis, and Shona Lamond is the Executive Director of Downtown Children's Center in St. Louis. Thank you all for joining us today. Clearly there's more to talk about. I hope that there will be a better, more positive conversation the next time we meet. Thank you.
Thank you.
This episode was produced by Maya Norfleet.
Our audio engineer is Aaron Dorr. This podcast was mixed and edited by Aaron.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
St. Louis on the Air proudly supports local artists by using music from Life Creative Group.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations, and leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thank you.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, saluting Earth Day on April 22nd with an ongoing commitment to help offset carbon emissions with sustainable harvesting of Missouri forests. Details at choosewood.com.